Hello and welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue, where our mission is to unite the Black and Brown communities through education, storytelling, and community engagement.
The vision of Black, Brown, and Bilingue is to be part of creating a world in which Black and Brown identities are affirmed, bilingualism and biculturalism are nurtured, and equity is the driving force behind all that we do. Thank you for joining us again today. I am Lisette Jacobson, and I am one of your hosts.
And I'm Maurice McDavid. I'm your other host.
Hello, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Black, Brown, and Bilingue. We are thrilled to have Dr. Joseph Flynn, Associate Professor of Curriculum and Instruction at Northern Illinois University. He also is the author of White Fatigue, Rethinking Resistance for Social Justice, and he is also one of the co-founders of the NIU Social Justice Summer Camp for Educators that Maurice and I both attended. So welcome to the show, Dr. Flynn.
What's up? Thanks for having me. How's you guys doing?
We're doing great.
Wonderful. That's cool.
Hey, we are so excited to have you here today. To get us started, we wanted you to just be able to tell us a little bit about yourself and your educational journey, kind of how you've gotten to where you are. I didn't know, by the way, that you are from the Peoria area. I checked that out, saw that. I went to school down in Galesburg. So Peoria was our big city to go to, and represent Woodruff too. So tell us just a little bit about yourself, your background, and then your educational journey.
Well, like you said, I come from Peoria, Illinois, born and raised, home of Richard Pryor. Proud to be from there, and graduated from Woodruff High School, so I'm a proud warrior too. Back in 1988. After that, I went on to Eastern Illinois University, where I earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy of all things. And then I got into teaching by way of philosophy, actually. And excuse me. And then I went on to earn a master's degree in curriculum studies from DePaul University in Chicago, and then finished my education at Michigan State University, go Spartans, with a degree, the doctorate in teacher education. And I started working at Northern Illinois in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction in 2007. And have been there doing my thing ever since. So I teach a lot about curriculum, of course, and educational change as well. But I think what my mainstays is social justice and multicultural education, race, and media and popular culture. And what I really focus on, to put it into one term, is whiteness studies. I look at the history and impact of this phenomenon we call whiteness in the context of America, because you can look at whiteness through a global lens as well, of course, but I focus mostly on the development of whiteness here in the USA, and the good and the bad and the ugly of this thing we call whiteness. And alongside that, I have always believed that it's important to look at things through the lens of popular culture. And that kind of gets me into being able to look at film and television and music with a really strong eye toward hip-hop, as well as other forms of media. And, that's about it. I'm a Libra.
So am I. I knew that about you, actually, and I don't know how I knew that, but I wanted to say, like, you're a fellow Libra.
That's kind of creepy, but whatever.
Well, I mean, we can't make any decisions, so
We
keep
evaluate
that balance.
Yep. So you touched upon your passion for hip hop, and I believe it was 2 years ago you offered a session on hip hop ed for the NIU social justice camp. And right now, just with everything that is going on in the world, I think we're seeing a shift in perspectives, and I'm hearing a lot more on hip hop being taught in the classroom. So can you first tell us what is your passion for hip hop? How did it get started? How did you become a lover of it?
Oh, wow. Thanks for that question.
That's a big one.
That's about to take me back. For real.
Take it back.
I remember the first time I heard Rapper's Delight from Sugar Hill Gang, and that was my introduction. And that was 1979, I believe, when Rapper's Delight came out. And hip hop by that point had already been circulating throughout New York since '73. So it was a little ways along. But then after Rapper's Delight, came breaking. Not simply the film, but the introduction of breaking in the Midwest. And so my cousins, me, friends of mine, we all started getting into breakdancing. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to act like I was good, because I got so frustrated trying to learn how to kick a windmill that I just decided that I was just going to be an enthusiast. But with that kinetic nature of breaking as a dance and art form, I had one of my cousins. My cousin Ray, he was into breaking and graffiti. We would go out on Friday and Saturday nights, and kids would be, out at, Westlake in Peoria, or hanging out at the mall, and, you'd see kids, trying to spit rhymes, definitely getting into battles. So at that time, it was still kind of situated as a fad in pop culture. But I think what really took me over the top was being introduced to Public Enemy. And I had loved songs from Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, like The Message, of course, but they also had another great song called New York, New York. I used to roll around with my cousin Ray listening to a lot. He turned me on to that. But then there was like this, I don't want to say it was a blank space in the history so much as I don't think that in the Midwest, at least, it was gaining steam as quickly as it was out on the coast. But then for me, all that changed with It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back from Public Enemy in 1987, 88. And once I heard that album, it was just over, because it wasn't just party. It wasn't just fun. It was, you need to sit down and listen to this for a minute. Now you can still rock out to it, right? You can still have a good time with it. But there's something deeper that's going on here, and realizing that complexity and understanding the message that PE was trying to present to the public, it just made me think about the group rather, in a different way. And then that made me think about hip hop in a much deeper way, to know that this art form can say so much more than what people had been saying about it up to that point. So that's really what got me into hip hop. Then after that, like Tribe and everybody else coming in right after that, because that's, to me, that marks the beginning of the golden age.
So I'll say a couple things here, Dr. Flynn. Number one, hip hop is nothing without the hype man. So even if you were just the hype man when everybody else was breaking, Lil Jon made a whole career out of being the hype man. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Right. So that's number one. Number two, I think that leads perfectly what you just said there, that hip hop can be used as an instrument, right, to bring about some of these changes and engage in some of these discussions. Works perfectly for our next question, which is simply, in what ways have you seen hip hop be used in education? And I think it's important when we talk about this, both to have some examples and some non-examples. Have you seen some ways too in which maybe people have attempted to make that connection and maybe didn't quite land it?
Okay, let's start with the not first, because I think when people started realizing that hip hop and in this case specifically rap music was more and had more value, then you started seeing people in, say, the late 90s, early aughts, trying to use Tupac to teach poetry, but doing it in ways that denigrated and infantilized the knowledge that students already had. It's like, who do you think you are, middle class white teacher coming into this predominantly Black space and using Black art form, a largely Black art form, to teach us poetry, right? We know what Tupac is about. We know what he's talking about. We don't need that. And so oftentimes in the early days, teachers were using hip hop as more of a novelty, as opposed to, a primary text, so to speak. And then, but then when you start get into work of like Ernest Morel and Jeffrey Duncan Andrade and others, you start understanding that it's not simply about trying to use hip hop as a way to get students to understand Shakespeare, so much as it is using hip hop as a way of helping students understand themselves and their own lives, right? And their own communities, which gets us back to what we would call the fifth pillar of hip hop. For those of you out there that don't know this, there are 5 pillars to hip hop. The first 4 being the DJ, and you always have to start with the DJ because that's where this all starts. And then the MC, the breaker, the b-boy, and then the 4th pillar is the graffiti artist. And then through the ideas of African Bambaataa, the 5th pillar is knowledge of self, and by extension, knowledge of self and community. And so when you start looking at these hip hop pedagogues like Morel and Andrade and definitely Christopher Emdin, you start understanding that each of these different pillars of hip hop can be used as ways to shape pedagogical practice, and not simply just talk about, well, let's read this cool poem by Kendrick Lamar and see if we can understand how it connects to, I don't know, Mark Twain or whomever, right? Mm-hmm. So hip hop in and of itself, we always have to recognize that first and foremost, it's a culture. It's not simply just rap music and how novel it is that these ladies and gentlemen can, spit words.
Mm-hmm. And what I hear you saying too, if I'm not mistaken, is it really centralizes Black voices, right? And Black experiences, whereas typically it has been used as like a comparison to white culture, right?
Yeah.
That's mostly what exists in our schools. Can you recall maybe an artist that, when you heard a song or a particular song that you were like, wow, this is my life. Like I can connect to this so much. Like who was that? Or what track was that?
I would say De La Soul, the first album, 3 Feet High and Rising, because De La Soul, they're cats from the suburbs, from Long Island. I grew up I grew up in, a working class neighborhood, but with a lot of middle class sensibilities, and the kinds of things that the radicalness that Public Enemy was talking was definitely more philosophical, and helped me that way. But at the time, you had the rise of gangster rap, and I didn't really know anything about that lifestyle, right? I mean, there were great songs. I grew up with Ice-T, starting with Ice-T, and of course Too Short, and then definitely NWA and everything that came out of NWA. But I didn't really know that life. The first hip hop album that I listened to that I felt like, okay, this is me, was De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising, which unfortunately is one of the hardest albums to get a hold of if you don't have a copy from back in the day. I think a couple of years ago, they put up all of their albums for download in one shot, because there was there's still a whole bunch of problems with copyright clearances and whatnot. But 3 Feet High and Rising is an amazing piece of work. And their sensibility was right there with me.
And I asked that because, again, hip hop and rap and just even the Black and brown communities, we are not monoliths. And I think when people think of hip hop and rap music, they do think of NWA. They do think of, just that one narrative, which isn't representative of everyone. And so I think it's important for the listeners to know that and to really broaden their perspective and perception of it. Whereas me, the brown community, we also love hip hop. And I think my experience has always been, I'm not Black, I'm not white, but I kind of like this. Hearing Snoop Dogg and Gin and Juice, and we loved that. And Mexicans love Tupac, and Tupac always showed the Mexican community a lot of love. But in fact, Johnny J is one of his producers, and he always was like, oh, Johnny J. Did you know that, Maurice?
I did not know that.
I didn't think you would, because I always joke with Maurice. I think I'm a little more gangster than he is.
It's funny you mentioned that, and I'm going to just jump in here real quick, Dr. Flynn, and say that I definitely can connect with you in terms of, I was born and raised in DeKalb, Illinois. There was more corn here, than, we had more cows than Black people, you know what I'm saying, when I was growing up here. And so, but my older brother definitely was a major fan, Snoop Dogg, and the album The Chronic, right? And so I remember growing up hearing DMX, Rough Riders, and so as I thought about a lot of those things, that really built a little bit of my imagery of what I thought it meant to be Black. A lot of that was formed right in these images of hip hop. And so hearing you say, though, right, that maybe you connected to something else a little bit more, because like you, I wasn't a gangbanger. I didn't really, connect to that. I didn't really know anybody who was directly associated with those. Well, at least I didn't know that I knew people. I found out later my cousin was running things when we had to go visit him in state, right? But I didn't know then.
I think one of the things that we do in pop culture is we take a couple of images and then make that represent the whole, right? And you go back to the early days of hip hop back in 73, 74, 75, when it was really in the streets and, in community centers, in dive bars. You had a lot of DJs who were predominantly Black. A lot of the MCs were predominantly Black, but you also had graffiti artists who just spanned the spectrum of race. There were Latino graffiti artists, particularly Puerto Ricans. You had, Black graffiti artists. You had white graffiti artists. And in my opinion, if it was not for Puerto Ricans, breaking wouldn't be what it is. So a lot of the great breakers, the great b-boys were Latinos. So, this notion, yes, hip hop is born out of the Black experience. However, at the same time, as soon as that egg cracked, there was so much more coming into and flooding into, as soon as that dam broke, rather, sorry, mixing these metaphors, but as soon as that dam broke, you had so many more people jumping into that water, you know, I mean, so, and that's one of the things that's so great about hip hop is that it's always been this highly communal experience, right? It's always been about, let's do what we can to have as much fun as we possibly can in this space. We don't need all that fighting. We don't need arguing. There are other ways that we can resolve differences, and there are other ways that we can enjoy each other's company on this, you know, on this random Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, whatever nights you want to choose, right? And I think that those early roots, we can't dismiss those. You know, they always have to be, they are always embedded in what is happening in hip hop. And that's a part of the reason why we talk about a hip hop community, because there are people out there here in DeKalb, over in Chicago, of course, down in St. Louis, over in New York, Atlanta, LA, San Francisco, across the country, Houston, New Orleans, you know, across the country, you have people who are actively negotiating what this community is, what the values and ideals are, and how to keep continuing to spread and do positive, right? Mm-hmm. You know, everybody's not, you know, Puffy.
Oh, it's funny you bring up Puffy though. I do remember watching Mo Money, Mo Problems and just being like, what a cool video. But I think me and Maurice are from we're much younger. Not trying to call you out, Dr. Flynn, but I think right. we were at a time where I think the video played such a big part and that imagery played such a big part in just the culture of hip hop.
Yeah, it did, and it almost hijacked it though. That's probably the unintended consequence, because you know, knowing Puff and where Puff comes from and his background in hip hop was starting out, you know, in A&R. It's clear that he always had a love for hip hop. But once those images started getting plastered all over MTV and every other outlet, you know, it started to produce a certain image of what hip hop is supposed to be and how it's supposed to look, and what were you supposed to be like if you wanted to be quote unquote successful in hip hop. And unfortunately, that late 90s era being dominated in part by artists like, producers like Puffy, could have been a bad thing. But then what happened, right? All of a sudden, Outkast appears, right? And Outkast basically completely destroys the formula that was being produced in hip hop, in the hip hop industry, not necessarily in the culture itself, but in that corporate imagining of what hip hop is. You know, Outkast came in and said, no. And like you said, at the awards, at the Source Awards, we got something to say. You know, the South has something to say, and they said a lot, and they changed the trajectory of where everything was going, and used video in different ways. Mm-hmm. And so, and then at the same time, you had an artist like coming out of North Carolina. You had is it North Carolina or Virginia? Almost embarrassed right now that I can't remember, but you had Missy Elliott coming out in 97, 98, I think 97. And that was a game changer. And she was not only able to change the game lyrically, she was able to change the game visually too. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the thing that's so great about hip hop. Just when you think it's starting to get stale, there's somebody that's coming up, you know, that's going to change the game. And then of course the game changed even more when we moved to the YouTube era and artists were able to basically break themselves.
Missy, by the way, is from Virginia. You had it right. When you said North Carolina, the first thing I thought of was Petey
Petey
Pablo.
Pablo.
And I was like, I know this man is not talking about one hit wonder Petey Pablo, is it? Petey Pablo. So
I thought too, North Carolina.
yeah. So Dr. Flynn, let me ask you this, because we're kind of talking our way through it. Hip hop has changed. It's had different trajectories. It's had different meanings in different eras. And so when I think about then your other passion, right, which is social justice, then my question becomes, okay, is all hip hop good for social justice education, or do we need to limit ourselves to particular artists? I guess I'm just wondering, in what ways can hip hop be effective in social justice work? And the second piece, obviously, this is Black, Brown, and Bilingue. In what ways kind of does hip hop maybe and that social justice work show up differently in the Latino community than in the Black community, or vice versa?
That's a hard question. First, I definitely think that, okay, so I and many of my colleagues believe that you can take practically any text, and depending on the kinds of questions that you ask about that text, you can get at particular themes that you're trying to promote. So you could take, let's see, okay, so you could take Kendrick Lamar's All Right, or you could even take Kanye West's Diamonds from Sierra Leone, and use those as texts that are specifically speaking to particular social justice issues, right? But you can also take something like Nelly's Tip Drill and read that as a way of getting to a social justice theme by breaking down those the ways in which he, especially in the video, represents women and the marginalization of women. What he does in that video. I mean, taking a credit card.
My mother said I couldn't watch that video. It was on BET Uncut. Okay,
I was
you used to stay up late.
Probably about 40 years old. My mom told me I couldn't watch that video. But I think it's always important to recognize. I mean, and this is true of any genre of music. So we can have the same conversation about rock and roll. So you can definitely take practically any song from, say, Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen, and they're always their music is steeped in a social justice mission. But then you could take a song, from Motley Crue and look at those lyrics and read those lyrics in particular ways to get people to be more aware of social justice issues and the ways in which different groups are being represented in the popular culture. Now, with Latinos, I think it's really, really important that we always remember that these, intimate connections between Black and Brown folk that have always been there. And when you started seeing artists like, Big Pun and Fat Joe, it was kind of like, it was kind of a way of the industry finally catching up to the fact that Latinos have always been a part of hip hop and the hip hop movement, hip hop culture. And when you get all the way up into reggaeton and other forms, you can't slight those, and you can't disconnect how those forms are directly tied to hip hop culture and hip hop history. So I think it's a great movement. And I was just recently, actually, as a side note, listening to another podcast, and I'm going to plug it, even though they didn't ask me to. It's called Hit Parade. So it's through Slate Plus. So unfortunately, there's a small fee, but it's the history of the Billboard Hot 100. And Chris Molanphy, the host, they did an episode on the history of of Latino artists on the Billboard charts. And of course, you know, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen this dramatic spike. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, because we can't keep misrepresenting the reality of people out there, right? We can't keep just, you know, summarily glossing over the, you know, these large communities. And the Latino community is just as important to the American pastiche as the Black community, as the white community, as the Asian community, as the indigenous community. And so that's one of the things that I've always appreciated about hip hop. Hip hop has been able to transport itself and reimagine itself in global ways. And through that globalization of hip hop, we've been able to look at social justice issues across the planet and within our own country through the eyes and experiences of a broad diversity of people. And that's an amazing thing to be able for this thing that's basically started, you know, in the Bronx in 73 by one guy, right? You know, so yeah, I think that's all that's really important.
So we hear people say, and I don't even remember who said this quote, but they said that hip hop and rap has done more for fighting racism than anything else, than even certain politicians. What do you say to that?
That's totally true, yo. I mean, you know, so it was, when you started the quote, I thought you were getting ready to go into the Geraldo Rivera quote about hip hop doing more damage.
Oh, I don't like Geraldo.
That community. And of course, you know, Kendrick, I mean, he was responding to Kendrick's performance at the MTV Video Awards, or at the Grammy Awards, I think. And of course, Kendrick then uses that as the launch point for his Pulitzer Prize winning album, Damn. and anybody had anything to front on hip hop, I'm like, okay, go listen to Damn and tell me how you feel, right? Mm-hmm. But hip hop, I remember when the Beastie Boys came out, and when in the late 80s, when the Beasties came out, what I didn't know was that the shows that they were playing were interracial shows. You had Black kids, Puerto Rican kids, white kids, Asian kids. A lot of people came out to those shows, and by extension, they were learning more. They were seeing more Def Jam artists like Public Enemy, etc. And then as we start moving through the 90s, and you start seeing hard rock bands like Rage Against the Machine, and seeing those crowds, and seeing all the people showing up for like a Wu-Tang show, woo, you know, to be able to get all those different identities into one space so that they can vibe with each other for 2-3 hours and be in that moment with each other for 2-3 hours, you know, and then allow them to leave and they see each other at school on Monday, right? Like, give each other that nod. He's like, I saw you, dog. I saw you, you know? I mean, that brings people together. And I think the biggest thing that we are, and I think this is evident from the events over this past summer, the more that people talk to each other across their differences and see their similarities and see the things that we love and the things that we cherish and the commonalities that we have, that, you know, brings down those walls of interpersonal racism or interpersonal forms of oppression, interpersonal iterations of oppression. Now, there are a lot of hip hop albums that push the envelope even further by getting the listener to question things like police brutality, mass incarceration, the war on drugs. You know, one of my favorite songs is from a group called Dead Prez called They School. And it's all about a whitewashed curriculum. It's all about the challenges and struggles of being a non-white person in a traditional American public school. and how racist that context is. I mean, it's a hard song, especially if you're not ready for it, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of hip hop artists who are out there really pushing the envelope to get people to question these things about injustice, inequity, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that hip hop is one of those key tools to help the community understand what's going on and how these things really play out. I mean, think about all the people that suddenly began to think about the idea of probation and the challenges of probation in the wake of, Meek Mill and thinking about Meek's story. That's important stuff, and you can't scoff at that.
Definitely. I want to point out that I have not used the word absolutely as of yet. For those of you that are just listening to the podcast for the first time, you don't know, but that's my go-to word. In fact, we may just edit this out. I don't know. But I was just thinking about it.
I was about to actually say it.
Absolutely.
So, I want to kind of close with this. Well, I take that back because I'm going to ask you two more things. We always end the show the same way, but before we get there, if you had to pick a song that represents well this moment in history in which we are living, what would it be? And I'll give you a second to think. I was just thinking about the fact that 40 or 50 years from now, people are going to look back at 2020 and be like, you lived through that? 2020 has been challenging for a lot of reasons. And I've seen all the memes. It started with Kobe, right, in February, man, losing a basketball hero. But then, and I'll give some personal context to this. In February, I found out I was going to be a principal. And I was like, yes, I'm going to be a principal. In April, in the middle of the pandemic, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be a principal. And it changed my tone, right? So with all that's going on, from Breonna Taylor to George Floyd to Ahmaud Arbery, these are names for us, but for families, that was a brother and a sister and a loved one, for friends, all that's going on, all the conversations that's happening. Is there a song or an album that you can like look to and be like, man, this maybe this connects well?
While you think, have you guys seen those people say, like, because J-Lo and Shakira had that halftime show, and they're like, who would have thought that they were ushering in the end of the world? Like, that was the beginning of the end, and that's supposed to carry us through.
I would have to sanely say, as if I'm really being honest, the first song that really does come to my mind, I got to go with Kendrick. And either the song, All Right, or the entire To Pimp a Butterfly album. Because the album is about transformation, right? And acceptance. And the song, All Right, originally in the text of the album, in the space of the album, All Right is not a protest song. All Right is a personal affirmation that, you've got all this, speaking as Kendrick, I've amassed all of this, success. I've finally gotten to where I want to be, and I've got all of these problems, and I don't know what to do with them, but God got me, and I'm going to be all right. And of course, in the wake of earlier protests around Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Mike Brown, We Gonna Be All Right started being used as, a rallying cry, right? And the song was elevated, to be this bigger statement, which is something that I love about not just hip hop, but art in general. You can always take something that just starts out as this small seed and let it grow to something that's even bigger than the artist, himself. And so when I think about today, the one refrain that keeps going through my mind is, yeah, it's great that we had a lot of white folks that suddenly wanted to be allies. We got a lot of white folks that are suddenly asking critical questions and coming to some form of consciousness. But of course, with the news cycle, that's going to go down. And then something else is going to happen and the conversation will go up again. And then the news cycle will, leave and, activity will go down and it'll oscillate back and forth like that. But in the end, we're going to be all right. I do truly fundamentally believe that, because I see the work that's happening around the country, in DeKalb, in the state of Illinois, around the world. When you've got the planet, my brother lives in Berlin, and he was in attendance at some of the protests in Berlin to something that happened in the United States.
Wow.
And they were out there in force, I mean, thousands and thousands of people in the streets of Berlin, with fists in the air, also chanting, "We gonna be all right." So that always leaves a lump in my throat. I'm starting to get one right now to think about how beautiful that is. And that despite the fact that there are people out there who want to be willfully ignorant, the fact that you have people who are trying to argue against well-established history, well-established quantitative studies, well-established bodies of statistics, personal testimonials from people about how they've had to deal with certain things across their life, not just one or two times, but repeatedly. It's all right, because we're going to be all right. Right. And I think we have to look at it that way.
That's
beautiful. That should almost be our closing. But one of our traditions on the podcast is to have kind of like our final thought. And usually Maurice will have his piece and then I will say my piece. But since you are our interviewee, what is the one thing that you want our listeners to walk away with this episode?
You can always find knowledge and inspiration in the most unlikely places. So keep yourself and your ears open. And for those of you out there who think that you can't understand what they're saying and it doesn't make any sense, well, here's a tip for you. Do a Google search of the song and the lyrics and read the lyrics. If you don't understand why Kendrick Lamar is a Pulitzer Prize winning musician, and for those of you out there that don't really understand the gravity of that, I'll put it this way. The Pulitzer Prize in music has largely been given to classical musicians. It's been given to a handful of jazz musicians, most posthumously. So like Miles Davis has a Pulitzer Prize, but he didn't get it until after he died. Kendrick Lamar is a living, breathing hip-hop artist who was the first one to get a prestigious award like that. That means that what that cat is saying on that album, and I would dare to say on all of his albums, is next level stuff. So I just say that to say that it's not just people out there just making stuff up. It's not people out there just talking about guns and drugs and, if I'm allowed to say this, bitches and hoes and all that stuff. There are a lot of hip hop artists that are socially conscious, that are experimental, that are stretching the boundaries of popular music and popular culture, and doing it in ways that allow them the space to be who they are 100%, while also helping us understand not just their context, but ours, our lives. As much as we want to say, I mean, we can spend an entire episode talking about Kendrick Lamar. I mean, not Kendrick, but Kanye West. But go back to his albums and listen to his albums. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is easily one of the best albums that has come out in the last 20 years. And I would say for probably the next 50. It's a brilliant record, right? give people the credit for what they deserve. And a lot of these artists are doing work that just does not get respected the way that it ought to across the board. You know, we have so much love for artists like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan. Well, they ain't the only ones, you know? And so I love hip hop. I'll ride or die for hip hop. And yeah, and as a part of the hip hop community, we have our conversations, we have our debates, you know, I mean, that's what all cultures do. So, you know, respect us and respect that hip hop is bigger than what you might think it is. You know, if you want me to respect country music, respect hip hop.
Perfect. That couldn't have been said better. So thank you for tuning in. I am one of your hosts, Lisa Jacobson.
And I am your other host, Maurice McDavid. Please remember that if you would like to challenge me in a freestyle battle, that you can do that and you can get this smoke. I felt like this is the time to say it right now because we got a hip hop episode. So thank you.
I ain't getting into that. But you guys have been so wonderful. This has been so much fun. And you two are amazing. You really, really are. This is a really, really great experience. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. And to the listeners, muchas gracias for tuning in.
Adios.